Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we've got another power rankings video. Week 14 of our power rankings series. We've seen a little bit of shiftments, not as much as it was last week, but definitely a little bit of shiftment in the top 10 and maybe a new number one. We'll wait and see if the number one spot was another thing that got shifted. I'll touch on all of this coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Now before we get started, don't forget to like this video and subscribe down below. Thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to do this with all of you guys, so if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below. Don't forget to leave a comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. Don't forget to stay tuned for videos coming out in the very near future. Sorry for any background noise today. I do apologize for that. And once again, got another very interesting video here. If you haven't already, go check out some of my recent videos, especially the one I posted last night where if the NHL had a script. It was a very good one. Check out the entire series if you want to. It's on the YouTube channel. I'll link it up in the YouTube card if you want to check it out. I feel like it was a pretty good video. But in today's video, we've got power rankings. This is week 14 of the power rankings series. So we've seen a little bit of shiftments from last week's power rankings. Some very interesting shifts that see a couple of teams go up into the power rankings and a few teams fall a little bit lower. So we'll touch on all of this here. We're going to start off as we usually do with the three honorable mentions. Third honorable mention I have this week, and entering the honorable mentions for the first time in quite some time, is the Vegas Golden Knights. They had a really solid week last week. They went 4-0-0. Now, in my opinion, it was between Utah, Toronto, and Vegas to put into the power rankings. I could have seen any one of those three wound up going into the honorable mention category, but after the Sunday win against San Jose, I had to put Vegas in there. They throttled San Jose 7-2. They had a narrow overtime win over the lowest team in the NHL at the time, Winnipeg, 4-3 in overtime, and then they took down Columbus and St. Louis. So it was a little bit more of an easier schedule, but they had three impressive wins, and then they destroyed the third team in the Pacific Division in San Jose 7-2. So because of all that, and because they are now 3 points clear of Edmonton for top spot in the Pacific Division, I am going to put Vegas as the third honorable mention. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with Stone, with Eichel. Defensively, not looking too shabby. Theodore's now back, and in net, they did lose Carter Hart this week to injury. So hopefully it's not something too serious, but Schmid was pretty good in the games he played in. So very interesting note there. The second honorable mention, and moving up from the third honorable mention last week, is the San Jose Sharks. They had another really solid week. They went 3-1-0. They wound up starting the week with a very impressive win over the Columbus Blue Jackets. Then they had an overtime victory over Los Angeles, got their win streak up to 3 straight games after a come-from-behind victory, being down 4-2 and then winning 5-4 in overtime over the Dallas Stars. And then followed up, like we just talked about, with the embarrassing loss to the Vegas Golden Knights, the team who they've not been in 11 straight games. So Vegas has had their number, but other than that, this team's been really great. They're at 3-1-0. They're with third in the Pacific Division entering Monday's game action. So all in all, Sharks are a pretty good team. They're still hanging around for a playoff spot. Celebrini looks like an MVP candidate, so I'm going to keep this team in the honorable mentions. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with Celebrini and with a guy like Philip Kurashev. Defensively, not looking too shabby with a guy like Mario Ferraro. And in net, Escarra's still been doing pretty good for the San Jose Sharks. So all in all, decent week there from the Sharks. That's why they are second in honorable mention. First honorable mention this week, and dropping out of the power rankings, not because they had a bad week, but because they were just the team who wound up falling out, is the Edmonton Oilers. The Oilers this week went 2-0-1. It was a solid week there from the Oilers. Started out with a win over the Nashville Predators, then a win over the Winnipeg Jets, two of the lower teams in the Central Division, and then lost in a shootout against arch rival, the Los Angeles Kings. So they got 5 possible 6 points, 2 possible 3 wins. It's not half bad from the Edmonton Oilers. However, I was debating between them and the Seattle Kraken of who to put in the honorable mention category after some really good weeks from a couple of other teams. I did decide to keep Seattle in the power rankings and move Edmonton down to the honorable mention category, but they are still a really good team, and they're still within striking distance of the top spot in the Pacific Division. So they're going to be in the honorable mentions as well. Offensively, the team's looking pretty good with McDavid, Draisaitl, Nugent Hopkins. Defensively, not looking too shabby with a guy like Bouchard, and that Ingram and Pickett have done enough to get the Edmonton Oilers a couple of wins. So very interesting note there, but the Oilers are going to be the first honorable mention. And now going to the 10 teams in the power rankings this week. So to start off with, the 10th team in the power rankings is the Seattle Kraken, same as last week. Kraken had a pretty decent week. They continued on with their point streak by beating the Calgary Flames 5-1. Fueled by Berkeley Caton's first 2 goals, beat the Boston Bruins 7-4. Then they lost in a very narrow overtime fashion to the Minnesota Wild. Very close game against one of the best teams in the league. And then even though they had a lead, they blew it and lost in regulation to the Carolina Hurricanes 3-2. Ending their point streak, but once again, the Canes are one of the best teams in the NHL as well. So they got 5 out of possible 8 points, including being really competitive against 2 of the best teams in the NHL, and the Canes and the Wild. So all in all, solid week there from the Kraken. Kraken. I do keep them in the power rankings. We'll see how they do this week, but they're going to remain at the 10th spot in the power rankings. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with Beniers, Catan, and Eberle. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Alexiak and Dunn. And in net, Grubauer and Lacord continue to be one of the best goalie duos in the entire NHL. So very interesting note there, but the Kraken are staying at the 10th spot in the power rankings. 9th spot in the power rankings and re-entering for the first time in a couple of weeks after being an honorable mention last week. The Detroit Red Wings, they had a very fantastic week last week, undefeated, going 3-0-0. They started the week with a win over the Ottawa Senators, impressive victory over there. Then they destroyed the Vancouver Canucks, which a lot of teams are doing right now. And then they pitched a shutout against another really good Atlantic team, the Montreal Canadiens. So all in all, solid stuff there from the Red Wings. They destroyed the Habs, the Canucks, got a very narrow win over the Ottawa Senators. Like, this team is rolling. They're still top in the Atlantic Division. They could easily be the first team to 60 points in the Atlantic Division. So all in all, Red Wings, they're having themselves a season, and they deserve to be 9th in the power rankings and re-enter them. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with the Brinkett, Raymond, Larkin. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Sider and Sherratt. And in net, Gibson has been brilliant over the past couple of months for the Detroit Red Wings. So all in all, solid stuff there from Detroit. They're back in the power rankings at the 9th spot. 8th spot in the power rankings this week, the New York Islanders. They do take a little bit of a tumble from 6th spot last week, but they still have a pretty solid record at 25, 15, and 5, and they went 2-0-1 this past week. They had a pretty solid week. Started out with utter domination, completely decimating the New Jersey Devils 9-0 in a blowout of a game for the Islanders. Then they lost in a show to the Nashville Predators before they finished off the week with a very impressive overtime victory over the Minnesota Wild. So 5 possible 6 points, including beating the Wild, and scoring 9 on the Devils is impressive stuff there from the Islanders. There are a couple of teams that did a little bit better than that. That's why I do fall down to this 8th spot in the power rankings, but still, this Islanders team, one of the best teams in the Metro Division. They're still second in the Metro Division, so they're looking really good offensively. Team's looking pretty good with Barzal, with Horvat, with Drouin, Duclair. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Schaefer, who's still having himself a rookie of a season, as well as Pelech, and in net, Sorokin is now the franchise leader in shutouts. So all in all, really good stuff there from the Islanders, but they're going to be bumped down to the 8th spot in the power rankings. At the 7th spot in the power rankings, after another great week, is the Buffalo Sabres. They were undefeated last week. They went 3-0-0. They beat the Vancouver Canucks 5-3 with an impressive victory. The New York Rangers 5-2, and then the Anaheim Ducks 5-3. So a couple very impressive wins against lower-ranked Pacific Division teams, and then a win against the hurting New York Rangers team, but still, they look good. Offensively, team was looking great with guys like Thompson, Quinn, Doan. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Power and Dahlin. And in that, Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen continues to be a really solid goaltender for the Buffalo Sabres. So they had a really solid week. Sure, they were against some weaker opponents, but they kept pace for a playoff spot. They're still in a playoff spot right now. So very interesting note there, but the Buffalo Sabres, great week going 3-0-0. They have won 13 of 14 games for the first time in franchise history, and they're moving up to the 7th spot in the power rankings. At the 6th spot in the power rankings, and once again falling down a little bit from last week, but once again, not due to their great play from this past week, just the great play of other teams, is the Montreal Canadiens. They had a very solid week last week. They went 2-1-0. Sure, it's not as good as other teams like Detroit and Buffalo have, but it was a pretty solid week. They took down the Calgary Flames 4-1. They took down the Florida Panthers 6-2. A couple of impressive wins over some lower-ranked teams, but then they also got shut out by the Detroit Red Wings 4-0. So that was a really bad loss there for the Montreal Canadiens. I mean, that team, if they beat Detroit, they're staying in the top 5 like they were last week, but because of that loss to Detroit, I am bumping them out of the top 5, but they still had a really solid week. They're still one of the best teams in the Atlantic Division, so because of all of that, I'm going to keep them at the 6th spot in the power rankings. This team's going far, and I think they could still win the Atlantic Division. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with guys like Suzuki, Caulfield, and Anderson. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Hudson and Matheson. And in net, Montembeault, Fowler, Dovash, all been looking pretty good for the Montreal Canadiens. So all in all, really solid stuff there from the Habs. But they fall to the 6th spot in the power rankings. 5th spot in the power rankings, staying there from last week, is the Dallas Stars. They had a solid week. They're up to a 26-10-9 record after going 1-1-1. Not a great record there from the Stars, but not a bad record either. They got blown out by the Carolina Hurricanes 6-3, which wasn't overly good. Then they bounced back really well in the second half of a back-to-back, being the Washington Capitals. Capitals, and followed that up with a narrow overtime loss to the San Jose Sharks, but they should have won over the San Jose Sharks. They had a bad blown lead in that game. So very interesting note there, but 1-1-1 is not terrible. They're still one of the best teams in the entire NHL, so really solid stuff there from the Dallas Stars, and that is why they're going to remain at the 5th spot in the power rankings, given the fact they're still one of the best teams in the entire NHL. Offensively, the team's looking pretty good with Johnston, Rantanen, and Robertson. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Heiskanen and Harley, and in net, Onger's been looking great for the Dallas Stars. So all in all, solid stuff there from the Stars, but they stay at the 5th spot in the power rankings. 4th spot in the power rankings, falling a couple of spots from last week. The Minnesota Wild, they had an identical record to the Dallas Stars, going 1-1-1 this week, and they're down to a 26-11-9 record. So not a terrible week there from the Wild. You want to see them do a little bit better, but they started the week with a very bad loss to the Los Angeles Kings, then beat the Seattle Kraken in a shootout, 3-2, impressive victory there from the Minnesota Wild, and then like we talked about, they lost in overtime to the New York Islanders. So 1-1-1 is not terrible. You want to see them at least get a point out of Los Angeles, but I mean, like, this team's been so hot over the past couple of weeks, and just going to put them down a couple of spots, like going 500 is not too bad. If you're the Minnesota Wild, offensively, the team's looking pretty good with guys like Eric Sinek, Kaprizov, Boldy. Defensively, Hughes and Faber look great, and the net Wallstay continues to shine. So very interesting note there. The Wild go 1-1-1, and that will be dropping them from 2nd to 4th in the power rankings. 3rd in the power rankings and going up from 6th spot last week, the Carolina Hurricanes. They were another one of those teams who was undefeated last week and are up to 28-14-3 on the season. The Canes started the week with a win over the Dallas Stars, 6-3. Then they took down the Anaheim Ducks, 5-2, and then like we talked about, they came from behind to beat the Seattle Kraken, 3-2. So a couple of really impressive victories there for the Seattle Kraken against decent teams. So very interesting out there. They won all 3 games they played last week. They're still the best team in the entire Eastern Conference. So I'm bumping them up from 6th spot to 3rd spot. I think it's deserved. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with guys like Aho, Stankoven, Blake. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Goss, Spare, and Slavin, and in net, Busey's been looking great for the Carolina Hurricanes. So all in all, solid stuff there from the Canes. They are 3rd in the power rankings, 2nd in the power rankings, and improving from last week, going up to 27-13-3 and keeping their win streak alive is the Tampa Bay Lightning. They had a really solid week last week. They went 2-0-0, only had 2 games last week, but capitalized on their opportunities. They took down the Colorado Avalanche in regulation 4-2, something very few teams have done all season long. It was an impressive victory there from the Tampa Bay Lightning, and then they smoked the Philadelphia Flyers 7-2, one of the best teams in the Metro Division. They're up to a 9-game win streak, and they are destroying their opponents. The Bolts look like one of the best teams in hockey. They look like one of the best teams in the Eastern Conference. Sure, they're still 2nd in the Atlantic, but this team's looking great. They're up to a 27-13-3 record, and I think they bump up from 3rd spot last week to 2nd spot this week because they do look like maybe the best Eastern Conference team at this point in time. Offensively, team's looking pretty good with guys like Kucherov, Hagel, and Point. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Moser and Radish, and in net, Vasilevsky still Vasilevsky. So all in all, solid week there from the Bolts. That gets them up to 2nd spot in the power rankings, and number 1 in the power rankings again is the Colorado Avalanche. They'd have a bad week to start the week, like we just talked about, losing to Tampa, losing back-to-back regulation games for the first time all season long. But follow that up with a couple of impressive wins, destroying Ottawa 8-2, and then beating Columbus 4-0. 12-2 combined record over those 2 games. They came back with a vengeance. They're up to a 33-4-7 record, and this team is on a heater still on pace to be a 125, 130 plus point team and be close to Boston's record. So very interesting note there, but even after the loss to Tampa, they bounced back impressively, and that's why they're staying at the top spot on the power rankings, still by far, points-wise, the best team in the entire NHL. Offensively, team's looking great with McKinnon, with Natchez, with Nichushkin. Defensively, not looking too shabby with guys like Makar and Manson, and in net, Wedgwood is looking great for the Colorado Avalanche. All in all, solid stuff there from the Avs, and that is why they are 1st in the power rankings. So definitely, those are all power rankings we're going to talk about here today. I love to hear your guys' thoughts. If you look at the ones who I took out and took in from this past week's power rankings, the Edmonton Oilers, who were 9th in the power rankings last week, dropped out. They're in the honorable mention category, and Detroit, who was in the honorable mention category last week, is now 9th in the power rankings. Just a little bit of a swap there, but just to recap, here are my top 10 teams in the power rankings as of right now. So the 10th team is the Seattle Kraken, the 9th team is the Detroit Red Wings, the 8th team is the New York Islanders, the 7th team is the Buffalo Sabres, 6th team is the Montreal Canadiens, 5th team is the Dallas Stars, Fourth team is the Minnesota Wild. Third team is the Carolina Hurricanes. Second team is the Tampa Bay Lightning. And the first team this week in the power rankings, again, is the Colorado Avalanche. It's going to take a lot to bump them from top spots in the power rankings. So definitely that's all I'm going to talk about in this video. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. Do you agree or disagree with me with my top 10 power rankings? And if you disagree with me, what would be your power rankings in the morning of January 12th? Definitely your thoughts on all of that down in the comment section below. That's all I'm going to talk about for today. Remember to like this video. If you're related to me, subscribe below. Thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to do this without all of you guys. So if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below. Don't forget to comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. Don't forget to stay tuned for videos coming out in the very near future. I also do a blog to about news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that. So check that out. I'll link to that in the description below. Can't wait to see you guys all for next video. See you guys soon.